At least I'm not stuck filing papers for the government like Rachel. My cousin laughed, pointing at me across the dinner table when my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, my assistant from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The room went silent as I answered, "Director Chen speaking," and watched my family's faces drain of color as they realized the dead-end paper pusher they'd been mocking for years was actually running a federal department with a budget larger than their entire town's annual revenue. My name is Rachel Kim, and this is the story of how my family spent 8 years treating me like their greatest disappointment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, until one phone call shattered every assumption they'd made about my life. It's a story about a government job they never understood, a military background they chose to forget, and a moment of recognition that exposed just how little they actually knew about the daughter they'd written off as a failure. When I came home from my final deployment in Iraq, my family had already decided my future for me. I was 26, unmarried, and apparently directionless in their eyes. My older brother Kevin had just made partner at his law firm, my younger sister Amanda was finishing medical school, and I was the family wild card who'd chosen the military over a real career, and was now paying the price for that decision. "Government work is stable," my mother said when I told them about my job offer in Washington, D.C. Her tone suggested she was trying to find something positive to say about what was clearly a consolation prize. "Good benefits, regular hours. Maybe you can work your way up eventually." My father was more direct. "After all that military training, this is what you end up with? Filing paperwork?" He shook his head like I'd confirmed his worst fears about my judgment. "Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave." The irony was that my grandfather, a Korean War veteran, was exactly why I'd taken the position. But explaining that would have required them to listen, and listening had never been their strong suit when it came to my choices. For 8 years, I became the family cautionary tale. At every gathering, holiday dinner, and cousin's wedding, I was the reminder of what happened when you didn't follow the approved path to success. While Kevin bought his third house and Amanda opened her private practice, I was still working for the government in their minds, a euphemism they used the way other families might say finding herself or going through a phase. The family hierarchy was crystal clear. Kevin was the golden son, the lawyer who had exceeded every expectation and married perfectly within their social circle. Amanda was the brilliant daughter, the doctor who made them proud at every charity gala and country club gathering. And I was the puzzle piece that didn't fit, the daughter who'd somehow graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown and then promptly disappeared into the bureaucratic abyss of federal employment. At family dinners, conversation flowed around my siblings' achievements, while my career was dismissed with vague references to, quote, Rachel's government thing. When Kevin bought a vacation home in the Hamptons, everyone celebrated his success. When Amanda published research in a medical journal, they framed the article. When I mentioned work, they changed the subject. Okle papa makable bakal drizi koaxi. The assumptions they'd built about my life were elaborate and completely wrong. In their version of my story, I was a mid-level clerk pushing papers in some anonymous federal building, probably struggling to pay rent on a cramped DC apartment, definitely regretting the military service that had derailed my chances at a prestigious career like my siblings had chosen. They'd created this narrative so thoroughly that even extended family members absorbed it without question. Cousins would offer sympathetic smiles when asking about my work, as if they were inquiring about a chronic illness. Aunts would suggest I consider going back to school while there's still time. Uncle David, who owned a successful restaurant chain, regularly offered to put in a good word if I ever wanted to transition to private sector work that might actually lead somewhere. Tonight's family gathering was supposed to celebrate Amanda's engagement to another doctor, but it had quickly devolved into the usual pattern of showcasing successful siblings while politely ignoring the family underachiever. I'd been listening to 20 minutes of conversation about Kevin's latest case and Amanda's research grant when my cousin started her commentary about career choices and government work. Kevin and Amanda weren't just successful. They were the kind of successful that made my parents' social media accounts look like achievement porn. Every family gathering became a showcase for their latest accomplishments, complete with photo sessions and detailed updates that my mother would share with anyone within earshot. Kevin's law firm had made him the youngest partner in their history, specializing in corporate mergers that regularly made headlines in the business section. His wife Sarah came from old money, and together they lived in a suburban mansion that looked like it belonged in a home decorating magazine. Their twin boys attended private school, played violin and tennis, and spoke fluent French. Kevin drove a Tesla, vacationed in Europe, and could be counted on to bring expensive wine to family dinners while explaining the vineyard's history. Amanda's achievements were equally impressive in my parents' eyes. Fresh out of her residency, she'd already been recruited by one of the most prestigious cardiology practices in Boston. Her research on heart valve replacement techniques had been featured in national medical journals, and she regularly spoke at conferences across the country. Her engagement ring could probably pay my supposed rent for 6 months, and her fiancé was a neurosurgeon whose family owned a chain of hospitals. My parents treated their successes like personal victories. They'd worked overtime to provide opportunities for their children, and Kevin and Amanda were proof that their sacrifices had paid off. Private school tuition, college expenses, graduate school costs, wedding funds, all justified by the successful adults their children had become. The family values they celebrated were obvious: prestige, financial security, social status, and careers that could be easily explained and bragged about at cocktail parties. Kevin could describe his work in terms that impressed other parents. Amanda saved lives in ways that made everyone proud to know her. Their achievements came with clear metrics: billable hours, salary figures, published papers, awards that could be framed and displayed. At every family gathering, Kevin and Amanda held court like visiting royalty. They'd share stories about high-profile cases and groundbreaking surgeries, while extended family members hung on every word. Their advice was sought on everything from investment strategies to medical questions. Their opinions carried weight because their success had earned them credibility. The contrast with how they treated me was stark and deliberate. While Kevin and Amanda got prime seating at the main table, I was often relegated to the kids' table or stuck helping in the kitchen. While their career updates dominated dinner conversation, my work was dismissed with phrases like, "Rachel does something with paperwork," or "Government jobs are so complicated to explain." My parents had perfected the art of damning with faint praise when it came to my career. "Rachel has a steady job," they'd say, the emphasis on steady, making it clear that stability was the only positive thing they could identify. "Government work has good benefits," they'd add, as if health insurance was the pinnacle of my professional achievement. The hierarchy extended beyond just immediate family. Kevin's opinions on politics carried weight because he worked with important people. Amanda's insights on healthcare policy were respected because she was a doctor. My thoughts on veterans issues or government operations were politely ignored because, in their minds, I was just a clerk who probably didn't understand the bigger picture. Family photos told the story most clearly. Kevin and Amanda were featured prominently in formal portraits, their professional headshots displayed on the mantle alongside their diplomas and awards. My military service photo had been quietly moved to a less prominent shelf, and no pictures of my government work existed because my parents had never asked to see any. Even the questions they asked revealed their assumptions. They'd inquire about Kevin's latest case strategy and Amanda's research projects with genuine interest. When they remembered to ask about my work, it was always variations of, "How are things at the office?" or "Still enjoying the paperwork?" Never anything that suggested they thought I might have responsibilities, challenges, or achievements worth discussing in detail. But there were signs that my family's narrative about my career didn't quite add up. Small inconsistencies that would have been obvious to anyone paying closer attention. The problem was, nobody in my family was interested enough in my life to notice the details that contradicted their assumptions, like the way I dressed for work. While they assumed I was shuffling papers in some basement government office, I wore tailored business suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. When my mother occasionally commented on my clothes, she'd say things like, "You always did care about looking professional," as if dressing well was compensation for career disappointment rather than evidence of workplace expectations. There were the phone calls too. My phone rang constantly during family gatherings, urgent calls that I'd step outside to take, conversations that clearly involved decision-making and problem-solving, at levels that didn't match their image of a mid-level clerk. But they dismiss these interruptions as, quote, government bureaucracy, or another paperwork crisis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Never questioning why a filing clerk would be fielding calls at all hours of the day and night. The travel was another glaring inconsistency. I was frequently out of town for government conferences and training sessions, sometimes for weeks at a time. Real filing clerks don't typically get sent to international summits or invited to closed-door sessions with cabinet members. But my family had long ago stopped asking for specifics about my work trips. They'd simply nod when I mentioned being away and change the subject to Kevin's latest case, or Amanda's upcoming presentation. My living situation should have been another clue. While they assumed I was struggling to make ends meet on a government salary, I owned a condo in one of DC's most expensive neighborhoods. When I'd mentioned buying the place, my father had assumed I'd gotten some kind of veterans loan or government assistance program. Smart to use those military benefits, he'd said, completely missing the fact that my down payment had been larger than most people's annual salaries. Even my security clearance raised questions they never asked. I'd mentioned in passing that my work required background checks and clearance renewals, but they'd absorbed this information without considering what kind of government filing job would require top-secret security clearance. The forms I had to fill out, the interviews with my neighbors and friends, the restrictions on travel to certain countries, none of this seemed to register as unusual for someone they thought was pushing papers in a bureaucratic backwater. The most telling sign was how other people reacted to me at public events. When we'd run into my parents' friends at restaurants or community gatherings, there was often a moment of recognition that my family completely missed. These were people who read newspapers, watched political news, paid attention to government appointments and federal initiatives. Some would look at me with curiosity, clearly trying to place where they'd seen my name or face before, but my parents would quickly redirect conversations before anyone could make connections. My mother had a particular talent for cutting off questions about my work before they could develop into actual conversations. When someone showed genuine interest in my government position, she'd jump in with comments like, "Oh, Rachel's job is so technical and boring you wouldn't want to hear about it," or "Government work is just so different from what we're used to." She'd effectively trained their social circle to avoid the topic entirely. The strangest inconsistency was my relationship with other veterans in their community. When we'd encounter military families, there was often an immediate respect and deference that my parents attributed to general appreciation for service, rather than recognition of specific achievements. They never wondered why retired colonels and generals seemed to know exactly who I was, or why conversations about veterans policy suddenly became much more serious when I was present. All these signs pointed to a reality that was dramatically different from their assumptions, but willful ignorance is a powerful force when people have already decided what they want to believe about someone's life. What my family didn't know was that Rachel Kim wasn't just any government employee. For the past 8 years, I'd been the Director of Strategic Veterans Affairs at the Department of Veterans Affairs, overseeing a $47 billion annual budget and managing programs that affected over 18 million veterans across the country. The paperwork they mocked was policy development that determined healthcare access, education benefits, and disability compensation for every veteran in America. My military background hadn't been a detour from success, it had been the foundation for it. During my service in Iraq, I'd specialized in logistics and resource management, coordinating supply chains for forward operating bases and managing budgets that kept thousands of soldiers fed, equipped, and operational. When an IED destroyed our main supply depot, I'd redesigned the entire distribution system in 72 hours, ensuring critical medical supplies reached field hospitals without interruption. Those skills translated directly into civilian leadership at levels my family couldn't comprehend. I'd been recruited for the VA position while still on active duty, headhunted by senior officials who'd heard about my ability to solve complex organizational problems under pressure. They weren't looking for a filing clerk. They needed someone who could overhaul a massive federal agency that had been failing veterans for decades. The promotion to director had come after I'd successfully reformed the VA's disability claims process, reducing wait times from an average of 273 days to 89 days, and eliminating a backlog of over 600,000 cases. The project had required coordinating with dozens of regional offices, implementing new technology systems, and retraining thousands of employees. It was the kind of large-scale organizational transformation that Fortune 500 companies pay consultants millions to achieve. My daily responsibilities included briefing cabinet members, testifying before congressional committees, and managing a staff of over 3,000 employees across 170 medical centers. I regularly met with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, participated in National Security Council briefings when veteran-related issues intersected with foreign policy, and traveled internationally to study best practices for veteran care in allied nations. The phone calls my family dismissed as bureaucratic interruptions were often crisis management situations that required immediate executive decisions. When Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, I'd coordinated emergency medical evacuations for veteran patients, working directly with FEMA and the Pentagon to ensure continuity of care. During the government shutdown, I'd been part of the senior leadership team determining which services were essential and how to maintain operations with reduced funding. My security clearance wasn't routine paperwork. It was top secret with special access compartments, required for my role in developing classified programs for veterans with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries sustained in special operations. I regularly reviewed intelligence reports about chemical exposure risks in combat zones and worked with DoD officials to ensure proper medical screening for returning soldiers. The international travel my family assumed was basic training was actually high-level diplomatic work. I'd represented the United States at NATO conferences on veteran reintegration, consulted with Israeli officials on treating combat trauma, and studied innovative prosthetics programs in Germany. These weren't junkets. They were fact-finding missions that informed policy affecting hundreds of thousands of American veterans. My Georgetown education hadn't been wasted on government filing. It had prepared me for graduate-level policy analysis and federal budget management that required understanding complex legislation, healthcare economics, and organizational psychology. I'd published papers on veteran suicide prevention that were cited in academic journals and had been invited to lecture at military academies about transition challenges facing modern soldiers. The most important part of my work was also the most invisible: the individual veterans whose lives were directly impacted by my decisions. Every policy I developed, every program I funded, every efficiency I created, meant that somewhere, a veteran received timely medical care, educational benefits, or disability compensation that might have been delayed or denied under the old system. But none of this existed in my family's understanding of government work, which seemed frozen in 1950s stereotypes of bureaucratic paper pushers, rather than modern federal executives managing billion-dollar agencies and affecting millions of lives. The cost of maintaining my family's illusions about my career went far beyond hurt feelings. Every day I made decisions that affected millions of lives, but I couldn't share that weight with the people who should have been my closest support system. The isolation was profound and exhausting in ways that even my military service hadn't prepared me for. The secrecy wasn't entirely by choice. Federal executives at my level operated under constant scrutiny, and personal relationships could become security vulnerabilities or political liabilities. My communications were monitored, my social media presence was carefully managed, and my family connections were reviewed annually as part of my clearance renewal. The less my family knew about my actual responsibilities, the easier it was to maintain the security protocols that my position required. But the deeper cost was emotional. When Congress grilled me for 6 hours about veteran suicide rates, I couldn't call my mother for comfort because she didn't know I testified before Congress. When a veteran's widow thanked me personally for expediting her husband's benefits claim, I couldn't share that moment of meaning with my father because he thought I pushed papers for a living. When the president cited my disability reform program as a model for federal efficiency, I celebrated alone because my family would have assumed I was exaggerating my involvement. The pressure of my position was immense and unrelenting. I was responsible for healthcare decisions that literally meant life or death for veterans who couldn't get treatment elsewhere. I managed budgets where every dollar cut meant services denied to people who'd sacrificed for their country. I testified before congressional committees where hostile questioning could derail programs that thousands of veterans depended on for basic survival. My military experience had taught me to compartmentalize stress, but civilian leadership brought different challenges. In combat, threats were external and immediate. In federal administration, threats were political and bureaucratic, requiring different kinds of resilience. I was constantly balancing competing priorities: congressional demands for cost reduction versus veteran needs for expanded services, political pressure for quick fixes versus long-term systematic reform, media scrutiny versus the privacy required for effective policy development. The loneliness was particularly acute during crises. When a VA medical center was discovered to have falsified wait time records resulting in veteran deaths, I spent 3 weeks managing congressional investigations, media interviews, and staff terminations while implementing emergency reforms. My family knew I was busy with work, but couldn't offer support for the specific challenges I was facing. I carried the weight of those veteran deaths alone, along with the responsibility for ensuring such failures never happened again. Personal relationships outside my family suffered too. Dating was complicated by security clearances and demanding schedules. Friends from my military service understood the commitment, but were scattered across the country in their own high-level positions. I'd built a professional network of colleagues who respected my work, but maintaining personal connections required more time and energy than my position allowed. The sacrifice extended to simple pleasures that my siblings took for granted. Kevin could freely discuss his cases with friends, sharing victories and frustrations without worrying about confidentiality. Amanda could post about her medical breakthroughs on social media, building a public profile that enhanced her career prospects. I couldn't share professional achievements publicly, couldn't leverage my position for personal networking, couldn't even put my real job title on dating profiles without triggering security reviews. Most painfully, I couldn't honor my grandfather's military service the way I wanted to. He died believing I was finally using my Georgetown education for something meaningful, but he never knew the full scope of what I'd achieved or how directly my work honored his legacy of service. I'd wanted to tell him about the veteran programs I'd created, the policies I'd reformed, the lives I'd helped save. Instead, he died thinking I was content with modest government work, never knowing that his granddaughter had become one of the most influential advocates for veterans in the entire federal government. For 8 years, my family's misconceptions about my career became more entrenched with each passing interaction. What started as assumptions hardened into absolute certainty, repeated so often in family conversations that they became accepted facts rather than uninformed guesses. The longer I remained silent about my actual responsibilities, the more confident they became in their narrative about my professional limitations. My mother had perfected a particular tone when discussing my work with her friends, a mixture of maternal concern and gentle disappointment that suggested I was doing my best despite obvious setbacks. "Rachel's still with the government," she'd say at book club meetings, the emphasis on still implying that I was stuck rather than committed. "You know how those government jobs are, steady, but not much room for advancement." She'd developed elaborate explanations for why I hadn't progressed beyond what she imagined was an entry-level position. "Some people are just better suited for supportive roles," she'd tell neighbors who asked about my career. "Rachel's always been more comfortable behind the scenes." When friends mentioned their own children's promotions and salary increases, my mother would nod sympathetically and change the subject, as if my lack of visible advancement was too painful to discuss in detail. My father's dismissal was more direct and cutting. At his weekly poker games with other retired professionals, he'd listen to stories about successful children and respond with resigned shrugs about my choices. "Government work is different," he'd say, the phrase carrying implications of lower standards and diminished expectations. "At least she has job security." When his friends shared news about their children's partnerships, publications, or public recognition, he'd fall silent rather than admit he had nothing comparable to contribute about my achievements. The family gatherings became exercises in careful topic management, with my siblings' careers dominating conversations, while mine was relegated to brief, polite inquiries that nobody expected substantial answers to. Kevin would spend 20 minutes describing a complex merger case, complete with financial details and strategic challenges, while my work was summarized as keeping busy with government stuff. Amanda would share stories about saving lives and advancing medical knowledge, while my contributions to veteran healthcare were invisible to discussions about meaningful careers. Even extended family members had absorbed and amplified these misconceptions. Uncle David would regularly joke about government inefficiency whenever I was present, making comments about taxpayer waste and bureaucratic incompetence that were clearly directed at my supposed career in federal paper pushing. Cousins would ask patronizing questions about whether I'd ever considered transitioning to private sector work that might offer real opportunities for growth and advancement. The most frustrating aspect was how they interpreted evidence that contradicted their assumptions. When I'd mention working late or dealing with urgent deadlines, they'd nod knowingly about government bureaucracy and inefficient processes, rather than considering that I might be managing high-stakes responsibilities. When I traveled for work, they'd make jokes about government conferences and wasteful spending, rather than recognizing that federal executives regularly participate in international policy discussions. My living situation provided constant cognitive dissonance that they resolved by inventing increasingly elaborate explanations. My expensive condo must have been purchased with veteran benefits or family money they didn't know about. My designer clothes were probably knockoffs or purchases I couldn't really afford. My international travel was government waste rather than diplomatic necessity. Every piece of evidence that suggested success beyond their expectations was rationalized away rather than forcing them to reconsider their fundamental assumptions. Social media made their dismissiveness particularly painful. My parents would proudly share every article about Kevin's legal victories and Amanda's medical breakthroughs, but they never posted about my professional achievements because they didn't know any existed. When news outlets covered VA reforms or veteran policy initiatives I'd spearheaded, my family scrolled past without recognizing my involvement because they'd never connected my name to actual government leadership. The community had absorbed their narrative so completely that even longtime neighbors treated me with a mixture of pity and politeness, typically reserved for family members who'd failed to live up to their potential. Mrs. Patterson, who'd known me since childhood, would ask gentle questions about whether I was happy with my government job, as if contentment was the best I could hope for rather than achievement and recognition. Perhaps most painfully, they'd begun using my career as a cautionary tale for younger family members. Make sure you have a clear plan after college, they'd tell my teenage cousins, so you don't end up like Rachel, just drifting through government work without any real direction. The evening that would change everything started like every other family gathering I'd endured for the past 8 years. Amanda's engagement party was being held at my parents' house, with the usual cast of relatives, family friends, and neighbors who'd watched me grow up and now regarded me with polite sympathy for my apparent career disappointments. I'd almost skipped the party entirely. That week had been particularly brutal at work. We were in the middle of implementing a new mental health initiative for combat veterans, and I'd been pulling 18-hour days coordinating with medical centers across the country. The program represented a $2.3 billion investment in veteran suicide prevention, and every detail of the rollout required my direct oversight. I'd spent 3 days in congressional briefings, defending the budget allocation to skeptical committee members who questioned whether the VA could effectively manage such an ambitious expansion of services. But Amanda had specifically asked me to come, and despite everything, I still wanted to support my sister's happiness. So I'd driven up from DC on Friday evening, exhausted but determined to be present for her celebration. I'd left my deputy director handling the final coordination calls, while I took what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend with family. The party atmosphere was festive and warm, with my parents proudly showing off Amanda's engagement ring and sharing stories about her fiancé's successful neurosurgery practice. The conversations flowed predictably. Kevin's latest legal victory, Amanda's upcoming research presentation, discussions about wedding venues, and honeymoon destinations. I found myself relegated to my usual role as the supportive but unremarkable sister, helping serve drinks and listening to others' achievements. My cousin Jessica had driven in from Dallas with her new husband, and their presence added an extra layer of comparison and competition to the evening's dynamics. Jessica worked in pharmaceutical sales and never missed an opportunity to highlight her income and travel perks. Her husband was a finance manager who spoke fluently about market trends and investment strategies that impressed my parents and their friends. As the evening progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to career comparisons and professional success stories. Kevin described his firm's expansion into international markets. Amanda shared news about being selected for a prestigious cardiac surgery fellowship. Jessica boasted about her sales numbers and the luxury car she'd earned through her company's incentive program. That's when the attention shifted to me in the way it always did at these gatherings. Not with genuine interest, but with the kind of polite obligation families feel to include everyone in the conversation, even when they have nothing impressive to contribute. "And how are things going with your government job, Rachel?" asked Mrs. Chen, one of my mother's closest friends, with the tone people use when they're being deliberately kind about a sensitive subject. Before I could answer, Jessica jumped in with her characteristic lack of filter. "At least I'm not stuck filing papers for the government like Rachel," she laughed, pointing at me across the dinner table. The comment was meant as a joke, the kind of casual put-down that families use to establish pecking orders, but it carried 8 years of accumulated assumptions about my life and career. The room fell into that particular kind of silence that follows when someone says something that everyone has been thinking but nobody has been rude enough to voice directly. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My mother shot Jessica a warning look that suggested she'd crossed a line, but didn't contradict the basic premise of her statement. I felt my phone buzzing in my purse and almost ignored it. Weekend calls weren't unusual, but I typically let them go to voicemail during family events to avoid the awkward explanations about why someone from my filing job would need to reach me outside business hours. But something made me glance at the caller ID. It was my senior assistant, Maria Santos, and she never called unless there was a genuine emergency that required immediate executive decision-making. I realized with growing dread that the mental health program rollout might have encountered a critical problem that couldn't wait until Monday morning. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more devastating. Jessica's laughter was still echoing around the dinner table when my phone rang, cutting through the awkward silence that had followed her comment about my government filing job. Every face turned toward me as I glanced at the caller ID, seeing Maria's name and knowing immediately that whatever crisis had developed couldn't wait until Monday. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but 8 years of federal executive responsibility had trained me to recognize when duty trumped personal comfort. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," I said, reaching for my phone as Jessica rolled her eyes at what she clearly assumed was my attempt to seem important. The room went completely silent as I answered, everyone watching with the kind of morbid curiosity people show when they expect to witness someone's professional humiliation. They were probably anticipating overhearing a conversation about filing deadlines or bureaucratic procedures that would confirm their assumptions about my insignificant government job. "Director Chen speaking," I said automatically, using the professional tone that had become second nature after thousands of similar calls. The silence in the room shifted from polite to stunned. I watched my family's faces change as the words registered. Director, not clerk, not assistant, not filing specialist. Director. Maria's voice was crisp and urgent on the other end. "Director, I'm sorry to interrupt your weekend, but we have a situation with the mental health rollout. Senator Harrison is threatening to pull funding over the staffing concerns that came up in Friday's hearing. He's calling for an emergency session Monday morning, and he wants your testimony about the implementation timeline." I was already shifting into executive mode, my mind racing through political implications and damage control strategies. "What's his specific objection?" "The staffing ratios we presented were based on the DoD recommendations. He's questioning whether we can hire and train qualified therapists quickly enough to meet the 6-month deadline. The VA Inspector General's office leaked preliminary concerns about readiness assessments." Around the dinner table, my family sat frozen, absorbing fragments of a conversation that sounded nothing like what they'd expected from their government filing clerk. Words like Inspector General, Senate testimony, and implementation timeline hung in the air like evidence of a completely different reality than the one they'd constructed around my career. "Schedule a conference call with regional directors for Sunday evening," I continued, pacing toward the window as I talked. "I want updated staffing projections from all medical centers before the hearing. And get me a meeting with the secretary first thing Monday. If Harrison's playing politics with veteran suicide prevention, we need departmental backing for our response." Jessica's smug expression had completely disappeared. My mother's mouth was slightly open, as if she were trying to process a foreign language. My father looked like he was experiencing some kind of cognitive dissonance that his brain couldn't reconcile. "Also," I added, "contact the White House Liaison Office. If this becomes a public fight about veteran mental health funding, we need to be coordinated with the administration's messaging strategy." The president specifically cited our program in his Veterans Day speech. We can't let Harrison undermine that political capital. The silence in the room was deafening. Kevin, who'd been mid-bite when my phone rang, had stopped chewing entirely. Amanda stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Uncle David, who'd spent years making jokes about government inefficiency, looked genuinely confused about what he was witnessing. "I'll handle the press strategy if media picks up on Harrison's concerns," I continued. "Draft talking points about our suicide prevention statistics and have them ready for review Sunday night. And Maria, good catch on this. Thank you for staying on top of the political temperature." When I hung up and turned back to face the table, the transformation in the room was complete. 8 years of assumptions had been shattered in a 5-minute phone call. The government paper pusher they'd been mocking was clearly someone who testified before Senate committees, coordinated with the White House, and managed billion-dollar federal programs that had presidential attention. "Sorry about that," I said calmly, slipping my phone back into my purse. "Crisis management doesn't really respect family time." The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone struggled to reconcile what they'd just heard, with everything they thought they knew about my life and career. The silence that followed my phone call was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a family gathering. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people enjoying a meal together, or even the awkward pause that follows an inappropriate joke. It was the stunned silence of people whose entire understanding of reality had just been demolished in real time. Jessica was the first to break, her face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked like panic. "Director?" she repeated weakly, as if saying the word might somehow make it make sense. "You're a director of what exactly?" Before I could answer, my mother jumped in with the kind of nervous energy that comes from realizing you've been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. "Rachel, sweetie, we had no idea you'd been promoted. Why didn't you tell us you were management now?" The assumption that this was a recent development, rather than my position for the past 8 years, would have been almost funny if it weren't so revealing about how little attention they'd paid to my actual career. Kevin, who prided himself on understanding corporate hierarchies and government structures, looked genuinely bewildered. "Senate testimony?" he asked, his lawyer brain trying to process the implications. "You testify before Congress? About what?" "Veteran healthcare policy, disability benefits, suicide prevention programs," I replied simply. "Mental health initiatives, budget allocations, service delivery reforms. The usual stuff that comes with running a federal department." My father's face had gone through several color changes as he processed what I'd just said. "Running a department? What department?" "Strategic Veterans Affairs," I said, watching as the words hit him like physical blows. "I oversee the implementation of veteran healthcare and benefits programs across all VA medical centers. About 18 million veterans, $47 billion annual budget." The numbers hung in the air like accusations. Amanda, who'd always been proud of her medical practice's budget and patient load, was doing mental calculations that clearly weren't working out in her favor. Kevin's most complex legal cases involved millions, not billions. Even Jessica's pharmaceutical sales, which she'd been bragging about an hour earlier, suddenly seemed microscopic in comparison. Uncle David, who'd spent years making jokes about government waste whenever I was present, looked like he was experiencing an existential crisis. "So when you said you worked for the government," he started, then trailed off as he realized the implications of his years of condescending comments. Mrs. Chen, my mother's friend who'd asked about my job with such careful sympathy, was staring at me like I'd revealed I was actually a secret superhero. "The Veterans Affairs Department," she repeated slowly. That's a cabinet-level agency." "Well, I report to the secretary who reports to the president," I clarified. "But yes, it's cabinet level." The cognitive dissonance was almost visible as my family tried to reconcile 8 years of assumptions with this new information. My mother kept shaking her head slightly, as if she could somehow make the conversation make sense through sheer force of will. "But you never said," she started, then stopped, perhaps realizing that they'd never actually asked for details about my work in any way that would have elicited this information. "You never asked," I said gently. Every time I tried to share anything about my job, the conversation got redirected to Kevin's cases or Amanda's research. After a while, I stopped trying. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. written clearly across their faces as they began to remember years of dismissed conversations, interrupted phone calls, and casual dismissals of my career. Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, probably replaying every joke she'd made about government inefficiency and bureaucratic incompetence. "The phone calls," my father said suddenly, pieces clicking together. "Those urgent calls during family dinners? You were managing actual crises." "Federal emergencies don't respect family time," I confirmed. "Hurricane response, medical center outages, congressional hearings, budget crises. When senators call, you answer." Kevin was shaking his head in what looked like professional disbelief. I had no idea federal executive positions operated at that level. I mean, I knew theoretically, but... He gestured helplessly, clearly struggling to reconcile his understanding of government work with the reality of what I'd just described. The room was heavy, with the weight of 8 years of missed opportunities, dismissed achievements, and assumptions that had never been questioned. They were beginning to realize that while they'd been treating me like the family disappointment, I'd actually been the most successful among them. The conversations that followed over the next several hours were unlike any I'd ever had with my family. For the first time in 8 years, they asked real questions about my work. Not the polite, superficial inquiries they'd use to fill conversational gaps, but genuine attempts to understand what I actually did and why it mattered. My mother was the first to break down completely. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We've been introducing you as our daughter who works for the government while you've been running programs that help millions of people." The apologies came in waves, each family member processing their own guilt and embarrassment at different speeds. Kevin, ever the lawyer, wanted to understand the legal and political implications of my position. "When you testify before Congress, are you representing the entire VA department?" he asked, clearly trying to grasp the scope of responsibility I carried. "Often, yes," I replied, "especially on policy issues and budget requests. Sometimes I'm the primary government witness for veteran healthcare legislation." Amanda was struggling with the medical aspects. "You oversee healthcare for 18 million people? That's more patients than most hospital systems serve in a decade." "Different kind of medicine," I acknowledged. "I'm not treating individual patients, but I'm designing systems that determine whether veterans can access the treatment they need. Policy work, but with life and death consequences." Even Jessica, who'd started the evening by mocking my career, was asking questions that showed she was finally grasping what she'd missed. "When you mentioned White House coordination, do you actually work with the president's staff?" "When veteran issues intersect with broader policy initiatives, yes," I said. "The administration's suicide prevention strategy, healthcare reform, military family support programs, it's collaborative work." My father was perhaps the most shaken by the revelations. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "he would have been so proud. All those stories he told about fighting for his fellow soldiers. You're still doing that, aren't you? Just at a different level." That observation broke something open in me that I'd been holding closed for years. "That's exactly what I'm doing," I said, my voice catching slightly. "Every policy I write, every program I fund, every congressional hearing I attend, it's all about making sure veterans get the care and benefits they've earned. It's the same mission grandfather had, just fought in conference rooms instead of battlefields." The shift in family dynamics was immediate and profound. Suddenly, my work wasn't something to politely ignore, but something to understand and respect. They wanted to know about specific programs I'd developed, challenges I'd faced, victories I'd achieved. For the first time, they were curious about my perspective on issues they'd only read about in newspapers. More importantly, they began to understand why I'd maintained distance from family gatherings where my career was treated as an embarrassment. "We made you feel like you had to hide your success," my mother realized. "We were so proud of Kevin's cases and Amanda's patients, but we never asked about the veterans you were helping." The changes weren't just conversational. Within days, my parents had updated their social media profiles to accurately reflect my position. My mother, who'd spent years avoiding specifics about my work, began sharing articles about VA reforms with obvious pride. My father started reading congressional testimony transcripts to better understand the political landscape I navigated, but the most meaningful change was personal. When I had to cut short a subsequent family visit for another crisis call, instead of sighing about government bureaucracy, they expressed genuine concern about the pressure I carried. 18 million veterans depending on your decisions, my mother said. I can't imagine that weight. It's not weight, I corrected. It's purpose. Every policy decision I make honors not just my own service, but grandfather's, and every veteran who trusted the country enough to put their life on the line for it. The family gatherings that followed were different. Not perfect. We still had years of misunderstanding to work through, but honest. They asked about my work with genuine interest, shared my achievements with obvious pride, and stopped treating my career like a consolation prize. Most importantly, they finally understood that success isn't always visible, and the most important work often happens where families never think to look for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.